Lecture on chapter 21. This is the second half of 21. The first half of 21, we talked about plate tectonics, and now we're going to talk about the rock record and geological time. You might notice I've actually switched around lectures 30 and 31. I had flipped them last year because of a lab activity. This year I flipped them back, but I didn't notice it when I made the schedule. Once again, because of lab. What we're doing today will help us with lab this week. So let's get into it. First, this is something that could be troubling to people. The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Who says so? That is the best interpretation that science has. If you take the Bible and you follow Ussher's chronology, you get an age of around 6,000 years from Adam on. And there's a lot of different ways you can interpret things. But in this class, we have to learn what the scientific interpretation is. You don't have to accept the scientific interpretation as the correct interpretation, because it is an interpretation, just like my interpretation of the Bible is an interpretation. So I want to make sure that I cover that before we start, rather than having students like, we're learning crazy things, we're learning untrue things. We're learning what the scientific things are, and then you have to, from understanding that, well, you are in a better place to develop your own worldview about these. So given that scientists believe that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, if we were to take that 4.5 billion years old and just spread it out over the course of 1 year, so 1 year is 4.5 billion years, then of course the formation of the Earth starts here, day one. The oldest rocks that we find anywhere on Earth are from the end of February. So the oldest rocks are somewhere around here. And then the oldest, questionable, but the oldest bacterial life would be another month or so in. I try to change. So that's the oldest bacterial life. And I say it's kind of questionable because the evidence for life, this oldest bacterial life, is, well, we find things that look kind of like bubbles. And we believe, I say we, scientists, believe those bubbles are the results of some early, like, single cellular organisms. So it's kind of iffy. Dinosaurs, what you generally think of, that comes way out here the last couple weeks. And humans are right here on the last day. So if you take this into perspective, you're like, wow, most of the history of the Earth is a history without humans as determined by scientists. Now, once again, your theological beliefs may be very different, and that is perfectly acceptable to me. I want you to understand what the scientists have and something about where it comes from, so that you can better determine what you believe and have a more firm belief. So here is another graphical illustration of the same idea. Now we don't have a week written on here, but we have the history of the Earth. So the history of the Earth starts right here and goes this way. And so when it says GA, GA means giga ages. And age means a year. So giga is 10 to the 9th. So 10 to the 9th, or billion years. So that's 4.6 billion years ago. You notice up here it says MA. A is age, M is mega, so that's million years. So 4.6 billion years and 4,527 million years are pretty much the same thing. It's a difference of 100 million years, which, what's that between friends? So if we look here, according to our best understanding of the history of the Earth, the moon formed very close to the time that the Earth itself formed. And then we have this period that's called the Hadean. Hadean because it was like Hades. It was like hell on earth. That is, everything was hot, molten. No chance that you could have had any life in that Hadean period. And then, well, during that Hadean period, you were in the early stages of the solar system. You had a lot of debris flying around, and there was constant bombardment of debris hitting the Earth. And so that would be another thing that would have made, even if you didn't have a molten, hellish surface of the Earth, you would have these constant impacts. And so life would have been destroyed over and over and over again if there was life in this Hadean period. Now, as the impacts with debris from the formation of the solar system decreased, we get into the Archean. Arc means old, so that is the old period. And that's when they have the first kind of questionable signs of prokaryotic life. We're not even going to worry about the difference of prokaryotes and eukaryotes here. It's an important biological distinction, but it's not as important to us in just understanding the history of the Earth. So we go along until we get to about 2.5 billion years ago, and we get to the Proterozoic. The Proterozoic is when we start to have some life things. And so that goes from about 2.5 billion years ago until about 541 million years ago. And that's when things get interesting. So this right here, this divider, no, that's not a good color. That's going to work. This divider here, that's what we call the Cambrian explosion. So about 541 million years ago, suddenly there was this explosion. What is the explosion? This explosion of life. The life forms, now, as you can see from this, according to what they have read in looking at rocks, there were some life forms, and the life forms were getting more complex, and we'll see some pictures in a little bit of what they were. But suddenly, at this point here, the life forms just spread out. So you had all different kinds of life forms. And so they call that the Cambrian explosion, when you suddenly have a great diversification of life forms. And then we go into more interesting periods, the Paleozoic. What's paleo? Remember, Archean was old. Paleo also means old. So the Paleozoic era, the old era. The Mesozoic, meso means middle. So that's the middle era. And then the Cenozoic, Ceno is recent, the recent era. And then within these eras, we have periods. And so we'll look at these a little more carefully. Now, in interpreting things, when we interpret the Bible, what do we use? We might use a Bible commentary where we look at what people have written about it. We might use a dictionary where we look at the words from the original language. We might look for contemporary writings from other people that aren't in the Bible. And we use all of these things to try to interpret the Bible. Well, we have the same type of thing in trying to interpret nature. As a Christian, I believe that nature is God's book. It's written by God. It's talking about, what he's created. Scientists have started with an assumption, a presupposition that there are no miracles. So science presumes no miracles. So that means they presume that you could not have had a creation event, because that's not natural. That's a miracle. Miracle is the opposite of natural. They presume that there could not have been a creation of life. There could not have been, the worldwide flood. All of these things that are miraculous, non-natural events, they presume, it's an assumption they start with, those could not have happened. And so then they're left, how can we explain the things we see? And so how do we explain it? Well, we explain it by nature. We explain it by the laws of science that we know. So we've already studied things about physics and about chemistry, and they take that knowledge and then they apply it to what we see to try to determine, now how could this have happened? So within the context of their bias that they start with, saying there can't be any miracles, it is the best answer that we can come with. Now, I, as a Christian, start with a completely different bias. I start with a bias that says there is a God who is an all-powerful God who can create. And so I have a set of assumptions, preconceived notions. So we want to understand how scientists come up with their interpretation. And we start with this thing that's called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism means that the laws of science are the same yesterday, today, and always, and that the things we see when we look in the rocks are the result of a slow process following these laws of science that we see in action today. It's a good assumption, and in fact, a creationist will take something that's somewhat similar. They believe that the natural laws have been the same the whole time, but there have been miracles, and that things haven't necessarily been very slow processes. So miracles and fast versus slow processes is how a creationist explains the same data with a completely different explanation. So when we look at the rock record, that is essentially what scientists use to build up our knowledge of the past. So all of this time stuff here comes from looking at the rock record and the things that are in the rock record. Those things may be organisms, the remnants of organisms, obviously they're not alive anymore. They may be chemicals, types of rock. There's all kinds of things that they look in to try to interpret. But that rock record, it's very long. We have very deep layers of rock, and many layers are missing. So when it says many pages are tattered, torn, indecipherable, and missing, that's because we have a lot of rock layers that may be missing here. They're over there, but not here. And so it takes a lot of work. What we're going to do in lab this week is do some practice with dating. So we have two types of dating that are used in geology: relative dating and radiometric dating. And we in lab are going to focus on relative dating. Now, lest any of you happen to be from, some of those states where they make jokes about inbred people, relative dating has nothing to do with dating your relatives. It's dating something by looking at what fossils are present, what the composition of the soil is, and comparing it to other layers with other compositions and other types of fossils in it. So they give you relative ages. They don't tell you what the age is, but they say this one's older, this one's younger. And that's what we're going to do in lab. Radiometric dating is an absolute dating. It's a method where we use the radioactive decay. Remember, we learned about half-lives, and use how many half-lives have passed to determine the age of a rock. Now, it's got some difficulties because no one was there to see how much of the sample we started with, but we have developed ways of calculating based on what's present now of not just the radioactive material, but other materials, how much there was to begin with. Now, some more principles in interpreting the rock layer: original horizontality. We believe that when you look at sediment, that is, when you look at the layers in the rock, that almost all of those formed underwater. And so you have a water, lake or something, and sediment flows in and fills the bottom. And then you have new sediment that flows in and fills the bottom. And so it puts down layers of sediment that are horizontal. Now, it's not all underwater. You do have some layers that were formed in air, but most of them are underwater. And even if it's on air, the general assumption is the layers are almost always laid out horizontally. So original horizontally means when you look at rock layers, when they were first laid out, they were laid out horizontally. Now, superposition goes with the picture I just did. The first thing down was the green. The second thing down was the magenta, and the third thing down was the black. So that means in terms of age, the green is the oldest, the magenta is younger, and the black is the youngest. That's what superposition is about. Younger things are on top of older things. And then a final principle, final for this page, is cross-cutting. If you have something that cuts through the layers, then it must be younger than the layers it cut through. So this layer 4 that's cut through them all must be younger than 1, 2, and 3. And this happens, a fault, when you have a crack, then that crack can have something come and fill it in. And so we call it an intrusion when you filled it in. Inclusion, not intrusion. It says fault or intrusion that cuts into a rock, and then inclusion is the stuff that fills it in. Lateral continuity, so inclusion is the stuff that fills in. Lateral continuity is that if you have a set of layers, so I have I don't remember what the order was I had on the previous page, but I'm just going to assume it was green on bottom and purple in the middle and black on top. And then if I look somewhere else, so I've got a separation here, and I look somewhere else and I find the purple layer and the black layer and then a blue layer, I say, well, continuity means that this here and this here, those are the same layer, and this here and this here are the same layer. And so I can set my relative times. This blue one must be younger than the green, magenta, or black because it's on top of the black over there. And so it allows us to date different outcrops with similar characteristics. Now, it's going to take more than 3 layers because you have layers that will look very similar. You have to look at sequences to really figure it out. I think this is the final of my relative dating information. Faunal succession. You've heard of flora, plants, and fauna, animals. Well, fossil organisms are going to be, the ones in the lowest layer are the oldest ones, and the ones that follow are newer. And so faunal succession means that those newer ones must be the descendants of the older ones. And it's not reversible. You don't go back and forth. Now, on this topic, let me point out something creationists often say. If humans came from the great apes, then why do we still have great apes? Well, because you have an offshoot doesn't mean the original disappeared. We might look at something like the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians are an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists. They are not at all recognized by the Seventh-day Adventist Church because they have some doctrine we find very weird. But they're an offshoot, and they developed their own thing with their compound down there in Waco. And just because the Branch Davidians existed didn't mean the Seventh-day Adventist Church should no longer exist. That offshoot can exist along with the original. So, the fact that we still have great apes should be no statement that says, evolution didn't occur. You can make arguments about evolution not occurring, but that's just not a valid one. Okay, so I do have a few more things. Sometimes you'll have rock layers and you will have the magenta. Let's see, it was green below the magenta and black above the magenta. And then you come over to another place and you have black and green, but no magenta in between them. We call that an unconformity. You have a missing layer, a gap. And those are very understandable, very reasonable if you think about how these layers are put down. You have a water situation and you're putting down layers, and then the water dries up. The water moves somewhere else. That happens. And what's going to happen at that point? Well, you're going to have some erosion. And so the top layer is going to erode down some. Now, if you look over here, it says, okay, what if we have a mountain building period? Remember, we talked about in the last lecture, if you have two plates coming together, then you're going to create stresses that causes the rock to crumple. I like to call them crumple zones. And so you build up these mountains, and then the high parts of the mountains are going to be eroded away. And so you're going to have some layers that get eroded out there in the high parts. And then you flatten out. So here you can see it's flattened out, goes underwater again because of changes in the earth. And you build up more sedimentary layers on top. And so if you take a cut, and if you take a cut right here, then notice you have layer, let's just number these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But if you were to come over here and do, oh, that's way too wide for my picture. Come over here and do the same thing. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is missing, 7, 8, 9. So you have that missing layer because it was eroded away. And if you come over here at that location, you're missing 5 as well as 6. So that's what causes unconformities. And like I said, they're very reasonable, very easy to understand why these would occur. Now a question, just to make sure you followed along. 3 dikes. The dikes are places where we had a crack and it filled in with rock. And the question is, which dikes, so they're labeled A, B, and C, is the oldest and which is the youngest? So in analyzing this, we have to remember our rule that if it cuts another layer, it is younger than the layer it cut. And then we have the other rule, the superposition. Older layers on bottom. So if we look at this, the oldest layer, of course, should be this one here. So I'll label it 1. And then 2, 3. Now, we start to get you have to be a little bit careful. So dike A cuts dike B. So since A cuts B, that means A is younger than B. B cuts C. So that means B is younger than C. And C cuts all of the layers except for the dikes. So I can continue up with my numbering now. 4, 5, 6, 7. And then since A is younger than B and B is younger than C, then C must be 8, and B must be 9, and A must be 10. So the oldest layer in this entire picture is the bottom one that I labeled 1. The youngest is dike A. Now the question, 3 dikes cut into the rock. Which dike is the oldest and which is the youngest? So just looking at the dikes, A is the youngest, and C is the oldest. So A is the youngest, and C is the oldest. So that was basically just a little logic exercise and very straightforward. Now, just a little information on radiometric dating. You're probably most familiar with carbon-14 dating. I took this from the textbook. 5,730 years is the accepted half-life for carbon-14. So carbon-14 is what you're most familiar with probably. But notice the half-life, 5,730 years. There's not very much carbon-14 to begin with. And so we measure the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 or to carbon-13. And that ratio is really tiny. And if you go one half-life, 5,730 years, that ratio will be cut in half. Well, by the time you go 10 half-lives, by 10 half-lives, there will be no carbon-14 remaining, which means carbon-14 can only measure out to 10 half-lives, or about 50, let's just round off, 50,000 years. So carbon-14 is really only useful to measure dates of things within the last 50,000 years. Now, if you're a young Earth creationist, YEC for short if you see it written somewhere, then 50,000 years is highly relevant. Everything in a young Earth creationist worldview has occurred within the last 50,000 years. So carbon-14 dating is highly relevant. If you are somebody who believes in the evolutionary time frames we've been looking at, where the Cambrian explosion was roughly 541 million years ago, then carbon-14 is really irrelevant. You need something with a longer half-life to be able to measure dates back to then. So this one here is the one we pay the most attention to. Potassium-argon dating. Potassium-argon dating has a half-life of 1.3 billion years. So that means from the beginning of the Earth, as we understand it, roughly 6 billion years, that it's been about 3.5 half-lives for the potassium-argon dating method. So that's very relevant for old ages. Now there's some other limitations. Carbon-14 dating only measures things that used to be living. So that could be an animal or a leaf or something like that. It doesn't measure the age of rocks. The other ones listed here measure the age of rocks. So when you see dates, here's a fossil that's this old, they're actually measuring the age of rocks that are around that fossil, rocks that are found with the fossil. So you have to know how much material you started with. Now, uranium-238 and uranium-235, those have decay sequences that end up in lead-206 and lead-207. So fundamentally, you might say, well, let's take the amount of lead-206 plus the amount of uranium-238, and that's how much uranium-238 we started with. That would be good if we could assume that there was no lead-206 in the original rock. But there's probably going to be some. So scientists have to do a lot of work, a lot of careful study to try to determine how much of the original material you started with. And we're not going to go into that, but I want you to know they do try to account for that. They don't make random assumptions. I'm sure you've seen people talking about carbon-14 dating who say that they assume that you had this fixed ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere. That's untrue. They have gone through and carefully calibrated how much carbon-14 to carbon-12 there was historically by looking at things that they know they can determine their age and what they get for radiometric dating from them. Now, looking back at our geologic time, so we started with we had the circular diagram. This one here is a straight one. And you'll notice that some of the dates vary just a little. Said 541 for the beginning of the Cambrian on the previous one. This one says 543. These time periods are shifted around just a little bit every year as they hone in on exactly what they're using for their differentiation. So things that you should know something about. You don't need to know anything in the subperiods or epochs. But you should know Precambrian, that is all of the time up to that Cambrian explosion. And that's when you had not an abundance of life. The Phanerozoic is when you have abundance of life. And the Precambrian has three different, notice we have eons, Precambrian, and Phanerozoic, and then these Proterozoic, Archean and Hadean are covering all the rest. So I'm going to just call those eras. So I'm going to call this the Precambrian eon, the Hadean era, the Archean era, and the Proterozoic era, just to make it easy on us. So you should know the Hadean is when it was like Hades, when there is no life at all. Archean would be very basic life. Proterozoic is plants and I'll say unsophisticated animals. And then we have all the stuff with lots of animals. So then we have Paleozoic, which is the old era, Mesozoic, which is the middle era, Cenozoic, which is the recent era. And Paleozoic then is subdivided into these 6 periods: the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian. You don't have to know the Pennsylvanian, Mississippian divisions of the Carboniferous. Mesozoic has the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Mesozoic is the age of the dinosaurs. It's the Middle Age or the age of dinosaurs. And then the Cenozoic is when we have the age of mammals. So what was it down here? It was the age of the fishies. Okay, so you should be able to name everything to the left of this dividing arrow or dividing line. So it's a fair amount to memorize, but it's not overly difficult. So let's look at what was going on Precambrian. So the Precambrian, 4.5 billion years ago to 543 roughly million years ago. That's 90% of the Earth's history. And during that period, you had, well, these things here were early on, considerable volcanic extents throughout. Meteorite bombardment that starts heavy and drops down with time. Cyanobacteria is a type of life form. If you've ever been to Yellowstone and you look in those pools and you see the pretty colors, those are because of cyanobacteria. This stuff that was living back there in the Precambrian is still alive today. Just like I was talking about, evolution and great apes. There's no logic that says, oh, the cyanobacteria should have died out because of other things that developed. Then you have the soft-bodied organisms, a primitive atmosphere and primitive ocean, lots of changes that we'll talk about, beginnings of the lithospheric plate formation and movement, and a homeland, Rodinia, a supercontinent. A lot of people only know of Pangaea as a supercontinent. That's the one that Alfred Wegener proposed. But we believe there's a lot of supercontinents that have existed in the past. So this Precambrian, large period of time, not much of interest in life forms. So here's some fossils from the Precambrian. So this here is stromatolites. Stromatolites are material deposited by algae and bacteria. And so they give us these cool things. And stromatolites are still formed today. But that's what we have a lot of from Precambrian rock. In the middle Precambrian, you start to get some plant fossils. And in the late Precambrian, you get these things here. These are your very famous trilobites. I think that's how it's spelled. So you have a diversity of the different types of life forms, but they're pretty primitive. And then, oh yes, I have to talk about atmosphere. It's important for the development of life, what the atmosphere is. The Earth has had, we believe, 3 different atmospheres. The first atmosphere, hydrogen and helium. Why hydrogen and helium? Because together they comprise the vast preponderance of the solar nebula. That's the cloud of gas that the all of the earth, planets, and the sun were created from. So in the early days, most of the gas you would have had would have been those two chemicals, hydrogen and helium. But the earth doesn't have enough mass to hold on to hydrogen and helium. Now, here's something I didn't mention in our last lecture that I really should have. What makes the earth into a sphere? It's gravity. The earth's gravity, remember, gravity is a force that pulls one mass to another mass. Well, all of the mass that makes up the earth is pulling it together. And so that's why it's held together. I saw this morning, before I was preparing for class, I was looking through core and I saw somebody asking if we can find the pillars that hold the earth together. I'm like, pillars that hold the earth together? The earth is held together by gravity. There's no pillars. And then I decided this must be somebody who believes in some crazy flat earth theory. But it's just gravity that holds the earth together. And it's gravity that holds the air to the earth. Remember when we talked about air pressure, we said that air pressure was due to the weight of the air above us. That weight of the air is derived because we have gravity pulling the air down. But the earth doesn't have enough gravity to hold on to hydrogen and helium. They actually can escape from us. So that first atmosphere of hydrogen and helium would have dissipated fairly quickly. But then we have a secondary atmosphere that comes from hot gases coming out of hot rock. So you have this hot rock that has gases in it. And so you get a lot of stuff like carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor that comes out of those rocks. And so, I have here water condensed to form. Probably wasn't nearly enough water coming from the rocks to give us the oceans. We also had cometary impacts. Impacts from comets, such as Halley's Comet or Hale-Bopp or whichever comet you find the most interesting. Those things are the same thing as Pluto, actually. They're basically ice balls. And those ice balls contain volatiles like ammonia and water that are in a frozen form. Well, if they come too close to the sun, they vaporize, or if they hit the earth, they'll vaporize. And so it's believed a lot of the water on Earth came from cometary impacts, and then it condensed to form oceans. Well, the atmosphere then has morphed. So it's not just we lost it, it's morphed. Carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere has been encapsulated into rocks. If you have water, carbon dioxide comes into that water, and then it will combine with ions like calcium and form, so these come together and they form calcium carbonate. I know it's CO3 instead of CO2 now, but they form a calcium carbonate, which is a rock that we often call calcite or limestone. And it precipitates and forms a sedimentary rock. And so carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has largely been removed by the water on the Earth to create rocks. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has dropped considerably. Of course, the water in the atmosphere has dropped considerably as it cooled and condensed. Photosynthesis has produced oxygen in the atmosphere. And so now we have an atmosphere that is about 79% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, with just trace amounts of other things. So that's our current tertiary atmosphere, our third atmosphere. So as scientists try to figure out what's happened in the past, especially when they start talking about life forms and evolution of life, they have to take into account what the atmosphere was like and what things could live in those atmospheres. Okay, getting into the Paleozoic, right? I'm not even spending time talking about the Precambrian. The Paleozoic, about 300 million years. So that is, it's going from about 543 million years ago to about 243 million years ago. That's more than half of the time since the Cambrian explosion. And these are periods characterized by changes in the life forms, largely fish. Fish dominated. They weren't the only life form, but they dominated There were more fish than other things. And the fossils we see are due to hardened body parts. Now let's talk about how a fossil is made. I talked about how sediment is laid down horizontally. Now, if I have a fishy that dies, here's my fishy that dies, and then I have another layer that falls down on top of that, it will compress that little fishy, right? And if this happens fast, or if there is no oxygen, then the fish will be preserved and crushed rather than decaying before it can be preserved. So you have to have either a fast burial or you have to have no oxygen in anaerobic environment. So not every place will form fossils. You have to have quick burial to form fossils. And so when you look at fossils, sometimes you'll see what they call extinction places, where you have lots and lots of fossils, and you see them in the process of living. So like you'll see one fish eating another fish because they were all killed at once and buried and preserved. So fossils are not found in all soils. They're only found where you have the right conditions, which means that you might never find fossils of, well, let's say humans. You might never find fossils of humans because humans, well, they didn't live in the water. And the humans will bury their own rather than leaving them in the water. And so you might find a burial site where you have all the humans that were buried rather than finding fossils randomly in rock. Okay. Each period within the Paleozoic and all the others has different life forms that are dominating. You have the tectonics, the plates moving around, which affects where you find fossils, and sea levels. The sea levels rise and fall. You have ocean here, now you don't. You know, if you look at Kansas, Nebraska, that used to be under ocean, we believe, but it's not now. If you go out to the Andes, there are whale fossils way up high. How do you get whale fossils way up high? Well, that used to be below sea level, but there have been mountains that have formed, pushed up, and pushed those fossils way up high. The Paleozoic is dominated by sea life, and so most of what we're going to look at is stuff that formed in oceans. So now we get to the beginning, the Cambrian explosion. You have all of a sudden the formation of hard-bodied things that have skeletons. And basically every type of animal we have today are the different classes that we have today were present after the Cambrian explosion, but most not before. So if we look at, well, the Cambrian period has hard-bodied organisms. Then we go to the Ordovician. And so remember, the Cambrian started at 543 million years ago and ends about 490 million years ago. And then we have the Ordovician, where you start to have jawless fish. Jawless fish, they're vertebrates, they have spines. And you have a lot of extinctions, a lot of things that disappear. You have land masses moving around. So you have the supercontinent Gondwana land in the south. And lots of glaciers, it's a cold environment, and sea levels drop. As you might have noticed when people talk about global warming, they talk about sea levels rising, cold, cooling, sea levels drop because more of your water is going into ice. Now we go to the Silurian. And the Silurian, here we can see a picture that shows Gondwana land. And this here is the beginnings of Laurasia, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And during the Silurian period, you have, as you can see, North America and Europe are beginning to converge to form that Laurasia. And you're starting to have some plants on land and some animals, scorpions and millipedes. Now, if we look back at those trilobites, I look at those and I say, yeah, I could see how probably scorpions and millipedes would come from those. So it makes sense, a progression going from those to scorpions and millipedes. Now we get to the Devonian, and the Devonian is the primary fish category. You have bony fish, you have lungfish and lobe-finned fish, which evolve, we believe, if you believe in evolution, they're believed to have evolved into the amphibians. Then we go to Carboniferous, which of course has this Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, and that's when we have the Pangea that Wegener talked about. You have Eurasia, North America, Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, all together. And what's the rest of it? Ocean. And so it's called Carboniferous because most of our coal is found in layers of sediment that are identified as part of this Carboniferous. And the collisions between Laurasia being this here, and Gondwanaland produced the Appalachians, which are right around here, and the Ural Mountains, which I'm guessing are there. I don't know where the Urals are. Actually, that would be these two coming together, then not Gondwana and Laurasia specifically. You have, sad day, the first insects and amniote eggs, and the Permian. So the Permian, you have the ancestor link from the amniote vertebrates producing reptiles as well as some mammals. We're going to go into the age of reptiles next. And you have this grand extinction. 95% of all of the marine species dies out, and 70% of all land species. So, it's kind of like doing a reset on life when you have this Permian extinction. But because 95% of marine species died out and only 7% of land, well, we're going to have more land species that are left over. What caused this? Maybe it was caused by the rise and fall of land. As sea rises up, the things that live there can't live there. So maybe, a lot of fish were just stranded in the shallow coastal areas. Maybe it was climate change. Maybe it's because the temperatures changed or the atmosphere changed. But that brings us to the Mesozoic, the middle era. And so this middle era spans about 180 million years. And we have the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. This is when we have dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are reptiles. And so we have most of the Earth's above sea level at this point. Pangea breaks apart, and we form the Atlantic Ocean. And you have subduction causing lots of volcanism and mountain building on the west coast. So the mountains that I love, the mountains I live in right now, are built here during the Mesozoic. You have pines and redwoods are plants that survive from there, as well as, sadly, flowering plant. Well, the insects, the flowering plants is not sadly. Most of the reptiles we have today are from the Mesozoic. One group of those dinosaurs, reptiles, led to birds. So birds you might think of as still dinosaurs because they are the descendants of those dinosaurs. Many of them have just become extinct. They have no descendants. And they also had a big die-off. So you have after the Permian, you go into the Triassic, then the Jurassic, and then the I don't want to say this wrong. Cretaceous, yeah. Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Those are dominated by dinosaurs. But then those dinosaurs pretty much die and mammals take over. And so what caused it? There are two hypotheses here: extensive volcanism, lots of volcanoes, or a large asteroid impact. In the Yucatan Peninsula, about 30 years ago now, they discovered the Chicxulub, I think I have that right, crater, an enormous crater that dates to about 65 million years ago. Is that right? I might have the date wrong because I didn't look it up. And it's very clear that that was a meteor impact that created that crater. And when you look in the sediment layers all around Earth, there's a layer there of chalk that has some shocked iridium in it. And that is a telltale sign of it being a meteor impact. And so they believe that because you have that chalk layer there with the shocked iridium, that must have been the result of this impact. And it is hypothesized that that impact would have created a bunch of cloud and dust in the atmosphere, which some animals couldn't breathe and would die from. The temperatures would change dramatically because of that cloud. So temperatures made some animals die out. And it's believed that's what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. Well, that brings us to the Cenozoic, the last 65 million years. The age of mammals, mammals have dominated. We have the Tertiary and Quaternary, the two different periods within it. But that's when mammals take over and dominate. And humans are right at the very end of that. And so in that time period, you have North America, Greenland, and Europe split, the Alps and Himalayas form. The Himalayas form, if you watch one of those simulations showing the tectonic motion, the motion of these plates on the earth that, move around and cause earthquakes and build mountains, it's funny to watch because India just goes flying north in the Cenozoic and slams into Asia. And so sometimes you hear people talk about the subcontinent of India because it came slamming into Asia and formed those Himalayas. In the Cenozoic, we have ice ages. It got very cold, and so it still is cold historically. And, humans evolved. Humans existed is what I like to say. And so that is the end of our very brief geologic time lecture. I'll see you next time.